Hey everybody, I'm Brian. My office is called ISA, and we've actually done a fair amount of affordable housing and highly green housing, and I'm kind of choosing not to talk through that lens today. I want to talk a little bit maybe about a case study of a city and how that's created an attitude about housing. We're working in Philadelphia and Boston these days, but also in Detroit and Louisville and Chicago. But I think that when we think about housing, we think about cities. I think that really, when we think about equity and we think about health and we think about access, cities for us are extremely compelling. And I want to make some observations about that as far as how it's affected our practice and how we're designing housing with Philadelphia, and as well as learning from it. So just to give you a bit of a sense of that kind of context or lab, Philadelphia has 440,000 row houses, which is just ahead of Baltimore, and those two cities are way ahead of every other city in the country in the idea of row house. And row houses are kind of miraculous sort of devices for living. Whether you're rich or poor in Philadelphia, you probably live in a 16-foot wide house. The difference might be how old it is or how energy efficient it is, but everyone sort of lives with this kind of restriction. But I also like to think this sort of extremely democratic sort of point of view on how people live. And I think it's kind of led us, we're really fascinated now by this idea of how different cities present different opportunities. And we're also kind of fascinated by the idea that cities don't stay the same over time. And this idea, we've been talking a lot in the office these days about the idea of the lab city, which is a place where a series of considerations come together. I think the best lab cities, and sort of Philadelphia we think of as a great one, but certainly other cities like Detroit and Baltimore, and frankly, in hearing Larry talk yesterday, LA to some degree, it's a city that doesn't quite understand what it needs because the economic pressures are not so extreme that the answers are apparent before you begin. And I think what's been amazing about working in Philadelphia and thinking about housing is that it's a big city, it has economic strength, it went through a real trauma in sort of the post-industrial era, and has really been reimagining itself as a city that's kind of on the rise. I think I'm kind of missing the diagram of the current state of the numbers, but the city was 2 million people in 1950 and was 1.5 million people in 1990, and has seen its first increase in population over the last decade. And one of the things we're really interested in is this sort of boom-bust cycle. And what happens, we opened in 2005, so we had a couple years before the crash. So Philadelphia was re-emerging, the housing bubble happened, and what kind of happened during it and after was kind of interesting in the sense that there was this real innovation period, and I think we're very interested in the kind of opportunities of the economic cycle and the way cities sort of fundamentally behave and where that leads us. And by the way, many cities have lab neighborhoods, we're coming to realize. So in Chicago, we've been working in what we would think of as a lab neighborhood. And I think a lot of cities, even like New York and Boston, have them if you look hard enough. So this is what Philadelphia looks like from the air. It might look like a lovely park-like setting. It's actually full of a lot of vacant land. And it's been something that the city has really struggled with of late. And I'm just going to walk you quickly through 6 projects. I told Andy I'm going to be 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and I'm really going to try to hold to that. But I'm going to be real quick, and I'm just going to show you a bunch of sort of case studies that really, because I think sort of demonstrate the idea of how we operate in this fabric. And there's 3 different things we do. One is infill, which is sort of fitting into a standard row house lot. Imagine it's 16 by 50 feet. Sometimes whole blocks are available, and we've started working at the scale of sort of multiple houses that are infilling in fabric. And then lately, our favorite thing has been leftovers, which are odd, strange sites that no one can figure out how to use. We've been having the opportunity to do that. And all of this stuff is market driven, and it's all green to some degree, but the reason why I wanted to show this work is because I think we spend a lot of time talking about the top and the bottom of the market, when actually most of the stuff that gets built with private capital is this everyday in-between housing. And I think that affordability and equity lies very importantly in that area if done properly. So this is a very old project, but I talk about it just so you can get into the headspace of how we've thought about Philadelphia. The challenge here, we're 1,000 square foot, $100 a square foot, LEED Platinum infill houses. So really these were imagined as row houses for sort of the new Philadelphians that were kind of showing up the last 10, 15 years. Largely young people, but we had some teachers and we had some government officials buying these homes, and I think these really did represent a kind of organic workforce attitude about housing. Really asked us to rethink the way we thought about it. We weren't interested in making houses that we thought were interesting and cool, just cheaper, but fundamentally reconceiving the idea of affordability and performance. And I'll just point out this sort of plan diagram. That house had 2 doors, the front door and the bathroom door, and really kind of behaved like an urban cabin. It had 4 corners, was completely flat, which is good both for cost and for energy. And so it really became an exercise in how do we activate flat, simple buildings, both on the outside where we silk screened on that one, and on the inside. This was actually the developer at home in the first house we did, and probably finished in 2008 or 9. It was really remarkable that these home buyers were rolling $20,000 photovoltaic arrays into their $150,000 houses. So we were really seeing that there was a sort of change in the attitude about some new possibilities for housing. And this is a very recent house that we just finished, kind of in the same neighborhood. When we showed up with 100K house, there was lots of vacant land. Now we're kind of competing with massive levels of infill development. So our house is actually in the middle, next to the chocolate banana, we like to call it there on the right. What's really remarkable is when this lot was purchased, the developer was worried that nobody would want to live here. And by the time we got this thing done, there were blocks of houses built around it, all of which are, this is certainly not affordable in the sense that, this house will probably sell for $419,000. But I think the point is that this house is really fitting a very large, first-time homebuyer market that exists in Philadelphia. And our thinking here, we've kind of come a long way around the power of architecture as something to, just getting back to this issue of design, I think in some of our early work, we really wanted to blow up the obsession with red brick houses in Philadelphia. We thought, well, why in the world would you do that? It's expensive, it has tons of embodied energy, and it's really just a nostalgic obsession. But we've actually come back to really liking kind of what the existing fabric tells us, and we were really psyched about this house, and we wish that our house was in a whole sea of those houses, because that's really, here we were thinking about how row houses are about the block, and that really the outsides collaborate on a kind of community. That sort of diagram on the left, this idea that you don't want every house to be shouting for attention, which one might argue is happening here, but that actually the insides of these houses are where really the action is for a lot of sort of people looking to kind of occupy these neighborhoods. And the idea here is that you have core appeal as opposed to curb appeal, was this idea that this whole house is organized around a kind of plywood sort of utility core. The kitchen and bathrooms are simply stacked, and there's this kind of fun journey from front door to master bedroom, which you can see there on the right at the top. What was interesting about this house too is the distance. A lot of row houses, you open the front door and you're sort of in the sort of living space, and kind of the private sort of transition is very thin. Where here, this sort of, by the time you get sort of upstairs to the bedroom, you feel like you've really traveled away from the street. At the block scale, to some degree, you can think about these houses becoming sort of aggregate and just finishing blocks. And these were extremely energy efficient. I would call them workforce housing units, selling from probably the low 2s to the upper 3s, 2- and 3-story row houses, and a small condominium building on the corner. Some of them were about 1,200 square feet, probably up to about 1,500 square feet. It was funny, this client was really getting on our sort of case about the color and how it was going to stand out in the neighborhood, and we said, you can't compete with South Philadelphia. And a lot of people walk by this project and don't notice it. But the city gives us so much energy, not only just in the way the houses are made and how they're articulated, but in the cultural traditions. And for those of you that don't know about the Mummers, it's a pretty sort of interesting cultural element that actually is sort of stationed down in kind of these neighborhoods. So we were really excited to kind of think about the surfacing of the neighborhood. And here you can see how it kind of fits into the block and finishes it. The parking is tucked into the middle, and all the stoops and corners are along the street. I can do a whole talk about stoops. Interiors are just extremely simple and sort of light-filled, and these are all LEED Platinum sort of performing buildings, probably doing maybe 70 or 80% better than Energy Code. So this is a very recent one that we finished up, and I just want to make a point here about the urban fabric. How are we doing on time? Good. Just the whole process of how the city has unfolded, it's interesting to see how buildings, the industrial fabric on the left at the bottom of that photograph, factories were kind of commingled with houses and bars and religious institutions. And then when industry left, they went vacant, and there were these sort of halos of distress that would occur around these large buildings. I mean, this was a 6-story wood frame factory building, which is kind of amazing. We had to get a variance to put housing in here because the building code doesn't want you to go that high in an existing building in wood frame. But you can see, there was this very small street called Wallace that was behind the block, and this was a combination of sort of renovating and adaptively reusing some buildings and new construction. There was unfortunately more demolition than we would have liked, but the big discussion here was to kind of reactivate what felt like could just become a trash and car alley, and to really kind of rebuild the block. And I'm happy to report, today, this sort of image on the right, there's a lot of additional investment happening around this project. So if we just kind of walk around it a little bit, so on the left there you see the existing building, which has been converted to 40 apartments, and on the right you see some new housing construction. But this is really my favorite moment, and I wish I had a before image, because this really was a place where people took their life in their hands at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we're really excited about the reemergence of Wallace Street as a kind of urban, kind of pedestrian way. This is where it meets the main street today, and we're looking forward to that parking lot to the right soon being redeveloped. And there's a lot of houses behind this photographer that are currently under construction. And just real quickly, it gives you a sense of kind of this is a little washed out, but on the left you're seeing kind of the typical row house plan. And on the right, sort of the reuse of the existing building with the kind of corridor in the middle, and it has a great dimension, obviously, for apartment reuse. And building had really terrific existing conditions and bones. And again, I think the point I just want to make here is about kind of the urban fabric mending and kind of housing as a device to build neighborhood connectivity and the social life of the city. Here's one of the row houses. So I think the most fun category that we're into right now are leftovers. This client came to us very worried about building an apartment building right on the elevated train. And by the way, I mean, this client, we love working for clients that have no business doing interesting buildings. We get them all the time. And hopefully they come to us thinking, I'm ready to use design and to leverage it as a way to add value to my project. But he really came to us saying, I don't know how anyone's really going to want to be right on this train. What are you going to do about it? And he thought really it was about insulated windows, and which of course we use, but we said, you've got to just go for it, and you've got to be on the train, and you've got to experience it. So really the simple kind of diagram of the building was, you can see in this sort of section perspective, was to create these terraces and these sort of view portals right out to the train. I mean, literally you're 10 or 15 feet from the elevated train at moments, and in a way it becomes sort of an overlook for that. And this is a 20 by 100 foot site, an 18 foot wide building with 7 units. So, fairly dense. The units are probably 600 to 700 square feet. Has done very well. And actually this whole corridor where we actually have several projects going right now has become an important address in the city. And I think this talks to this idea of housing and its relationship to the city, and really re-engaging with all of the quirky, odd opportunities that frankly create affordability and value. By being able to use this site, we were able to deliver a building that has sort of moderate rents, and others would have a hard time reusing. So that's a really exciting sort of undertaking for us these days. Also, just from an operational kind of design method standpoint, this sort of section diagram really is almost an illustration of the zoning code between a mean roof limitation and the requirement for a cornice peak there on the front. So we kind of like this idea of just, it's kind of funny, I really enjoyed Larry's comments about the kind of trickery of thinking about rules, and I think we're always talking about loopholes, that there are things that you're being told to do, and on the one hand you can attempt to, from the kind of ground up, change things, but on the other hand you can kind of re-engineer, you can sort of reverse engineer some of those regulations and really have some fun with it. And I think create a real sense of meaning in what the local condition is. And then that's what it's like, as far as the relationship to the train. And each of the units has kind of a sort of unique terrace that either looks back toward the city and the sky or out to the train. We actually have a project that we just finished that's not photographed, where actually you get a bit, we actually are a little bit more adventurous by kind of pushing the terraces right on the train line, which is a really exciting experience. So the kind of last leftover I'll talk about just went under construction, and it's in the Chinatown neighborhood in Philadelphia. And again, it's a 70-foot tall wood frame building. We've been doing these sort of extreme single-stair buildings lately in Philly that really push the edge of what the building code allows. But again, it's a way of moderating costs. What's really remarkable about this site is it's 12 feet wide. This building's actually 11 feet clear wide. And it's a true leftover. The site, which was cut when the highway was put through Center City, I-676, when we first went out to see the site, we couldn't find it. It was literally a parking lot for 2 cars. And it was literally a piece of land that was developable. And by the way, this was a by right permit. There was no zoning variance required for this project. I will say that Elle and I misinterpreted a couple of things which we didn't raise to them. But what was kind of interesting about it, again, and sort of squeezing value out of these difficult to use places, this really is by all measure a 4-story building, and we're using mezzanines to create a kind of double height space and to both expand the verticality of the building, but also to use this sort of bay window provision in the zoning code to expand the width of the building strategically. And in a way, I think in the end, these units are actually quite spacious, and through the use of windowing and this kind of connected mezzanine, we think it's going to have sort of a real generosity of space. Again, I think I kind of consider these in the kind of category of market tempered as far as cost, and just making this point that I think by kind of cleverly engaging with the site and its rules, we're able to almost unlock a layer of housing that isn't so obvious from a kind of standard development point of view. It's actually my last slide. Thanks.